But I study geopolitics. I study that region. I have top experts on from around the world, whether it's General Hamid Gul, the former head of Pakistani intelligence, or Ray McGovern, the CIA morning briefer, to George Bush Sr. and Ronald Reagan, to folks like Colonel Schaefer that ran Stratus Ivy, the group that was not authorized to kill bin Laden, even though they were able to twice. I have a lot of sources, and I have sources in Israel. We had them on yesterday, high-level sources. And they say this is a triple, quadruple cross, Saudi Arabia going in alone, but that's only cover so that any outcome can be declared a victory by Obama and the globalists. The neocons are involved in this as well. Zbigniew Brzezinski's involved. The Wolfowitz doctrine and the Brzezinski doctrine are almost identical. There are two different power groups, but they intersect at many levels. Iran's involved, but the president of Iraq has said that they're double-crossing them as well and wanted to take about a third of the country as a new Shiite state. You've got a Sunni group that wants to create a new country out of part of Syria and western central Iraq. You got Saudi Arabia that said they want part of Iraq. You've got a lot of weirdness going on here, but it's a mess. But no one can deny that Stinger missiles and other IMPADs were given to these different jihadi groups, Sunni groups out of Saudi Arabia, and that Saudi Arabia is deeply involved in this. It is quite a spaghetti bucket to really try to figure out. But I think in the final equation, the establishment see, con artists and authoritarians think that full spectrum dominance, in my experience, is really sophisticated. The truth is, it always unravels. It's dishonorable. Corrupt, authoritarian brains always think their subterfuge is ensnaring everybody else, but in the end, it's the pit they fall into. That's my view. Short segment, long segment coming up. Peter Van Buren, WeMeantWell.com, is an author now. He's a major whistleblower, 22-year veteran of the State Department, spent a lot of time in Iraq, was part of a lot of the major PSYOP operations there, and then he's gone public and currently works to represent a group working with Edward Snowden and trying to get his information out. And again, he resigned honorably because he was basically a conscientious objector and did not want to be involved in the immoral things he saw happening. We only got 3 minutes. I appreciate you coming on. Give me your bottom line take, and we're going to come back on what's going on. I just stated the bizarre gestalt. What's your expert take?
I absolutely agree with that. Many people in the United States imagine this all as a chess game where there's our side and their side, and we make a move and they make a move. In fact, it's completely chaotic. There are so many different players, so many different levels of war, that it's absolutely inconceivable that the United States intervention, whether it's 100 special forces or 10,000 regular troops, is going to make any significant difference other than to draw us back into the same quagmire I thought we walked out of 3 years ago.
Continue.
What we have in Iraq now is inevitable. It is the inevitable outcome of the 2003 invasion. In 1991, the first Gulf War, the first President Bush understood that he was resetting a balance of power in the Middle East. It was messy, it was uncomfortable, but it was in balance. And so after clearing the Iraqis out of Kuwait, the United States did not invade Iraq in 1991. And that was with the support of then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, who had his pre-Voldemort days. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq destroyed that balance of power. It ended civil society in Iraq, and it set loose the forces that had been kept on at least a dull simmer. Suddenly, Sunnis, Shias, Kurds were at the loose, and that brought in the wolves. The Iranians came in on the Shia side, the Saudis and the Kuwaitis went in on the Sunni side. The Kurds were settling scores with the Turks and with the Iranians, and the United States was bumbling in the middle of all this, trying to break up a fight with 5 pit bulls. If you stand in the middle of 5 pit bulls, there's a real good chance that you're not sure who's going to win, but you do know who's going to lose. And in this case, I'm afraid it was the United States who has made a terrible mistake by getting into Iraq and is continuing to dig that hole deeper by reinserting themselves into Iraq, as we understand President Obama plans to announce.
Man, I think Peter Van Buren is about the most articulate person we know on the subject of Iraq, I guess because he's been there in the middle of it. Amazing. I want to see where he thinks this is all going.
Amarillo by morning, Amarillo's on my mind.
But will it be Baghdad by morning, the giant $7 billion, $10 billion, there's different estimate, dollar, biggest U.S. embassy in the world, in the middle of Baghdad, the Green Zone, already 200-plus troops sent to guard it. You've got ISIS, admittedly filled with al-Qaeda people and worse, running around chopping the Iraqi military and police heads off, murdering Christians. And then I see Fareed Zakaria on CNN endorsing it 2 mornings ago, saying how bad the president of Iraq is because he's with the Iranians. And then I see the prime minister, I call him president, criticizing Iran, claiming they're involved in a double deal, wanting a war. And then I see the weapons that were sent there to that region, right across the border to Syria in the last 3 years. Clearly, the blame is with the power structure. The blame is with Bush Jr. and Cheney going in there in 2003 on lies. But it continues with the same warmongering system that they've, through proxies, taken down Libya, trying to take down Syria, and are now acting like they have no idea what's going on with ISIS. But then you see the power structure in the U.S., different groups endorsing different sides, Obama making a deal with Iran. That reportedly made Saudi Arabia mad, and so Saudi Arabia has launched this rogue attack. I want to dissect it and then ask you where it's all really going, because you just broke down what happened previously and some of the history of it. Peter Van Buren, WeMeantWell.com, State Department 24-year veteran who blew the whistle. He's got his new book, Ghost of Tom Joad, who we will do an interview with him in the near future, I promise, on that book specifically. We'll talk about that some today as well, but that's on another subject. But continuing here, Peter, you've got the floor. Break down, then, more of the history, where we currently are, and who you think is really behind the ISIS invasion and where you think that's going.
Iraq right now is like a very, very large bucket of manure. You know, every time you take a handful out, all that's underneath that is more manure. Let's take a look back in history. In 2003, the Middle East was a difficult, messy, but somewhat stable situation. Saddam, for all his terrible, terrible things that he did as a dictator, was holding the disparate elements of Iraq together. Broadly, Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds, but of course within each of those groups there are many subgroups and splinter groups and people with different, very different opinions. When we went in 2003 and got rid of Saddam, a regime change very similar to the regime change that the Obama administration is now starting to bleed about with Maliki, getting him out of there. When we did that regime change in 2003, there was nothing to replace it. I was there for a big piece of that reconstruction, working for the State Department. In fact, that's the whole theme of my first book, We Meant Well, how I helped lose the war. And it was the whistleblowing in that book that got me run out of the State Department. We failed to reestablish either a strong central government or a basis of power that Iraq and the greater Middle East could live with. Instead, we flirted with one side or the other, particularly bouncing between the Sunnis and the Shias to see which one we were going to support. But ultimately, the bulk of American support came down behind Maliki. In 2006, we assisted him, if not appointed him, in taking over as prime minister. We watched as the bombing of the Shia mosque in Samara triggered off the insurgency/civil war that we're seeing continuing now. We then continued to support Maliki despite his clear ties to Iran, trading what we thought was the long-term empowerment of Iran throughout the Middle East for some short-term gains and stability that would allow us to find an exit strategy in Iraq. And if these things sound complicated, they actually are. And one of the reasons we're seeing the chaos in Iraq right now, and we're going to see it continue, there's no question about that, is because these issues are complex and are not good things to solve, or resolve perhaps is a better word, with simple answers. The United States tried those simple answers for 9 years of occupation. We spent $2 trillion. We spent $42 billion training the Iraqi army, which outdid the French recently in terms of throwing down their weapons and running away. And we sacrificed 4,500 American lives. If all of that was too simple an answer, and it was, it's very unlikely that the United States is going to be able to do anything to kind of settle this problem now. What I'd like to do is talk about why what we're going to be doing will only make things worse. But I'll stop for a moment, Alex, to see if you have a different direction you wanted me to take it.
Well, no, I mean, I totally agree with you. Just as a layman trying to research this from the outside and reporting on it for almost 20 years on air, it just seems to be a black hole that the military-industrial complex keeps stirred up. So there's people in the State Department, there's military personnel, there's even people in the CIA who genuinely want to stabilize and have a good civilization and who want to promote peace and prosperity. But at the higher levels, you've got an establishment that wants chaos and makes money off no-bid contracts. And it looks to me like they know that blowing up the Golden Mosque, as Ray McGovern here said, was really a false flag to get a civil war going. We caught, in 2006, British Special Forces dressed up like Wahhabists running around killing Shiites to get it going. So at one level, it is mismanagement and funding all sides. But when you get down to brass tacks, that's what they tell people that are moral. And so to us, it looks like it's just a big screw-up. I mean, isn't this really at a certain level premeditated, that there are those that are milking the chaos?
Certainly there are those who are milking the chaos. To say it's premeditated almost gives these folks more credit than they deserve. If it was premeditated, that at least is a plan, an evil, sad plan, but a plan nonetheless. My belief is certainly there are people who take advantage of chaos or who seek to get these things for their own advantage, and the defense contractors and people like Blackwater are way at the front of that list. Instead, my experience both in 24 years at the State Department and the time I was actually physically in Iraq negotiating with Sunnis and Shias was that what America did for those 9 years was chase a series of ever-changing short-term goals. The surge is a perfect example of a short-term goal. The idea was to figure out a way to put the Sunnis out of the fight, at least temporarily. And what we did is we went in and we basically paid them extraordinary amounts of money to stop fighting. At the same time, we allowed them to either settle scores amongst themselves or using U.S. Special Forces to pick off a few bad guys that they didn't like within their own ranks. All a Sunni sheikh had to do really was say, that guy over there is Al-Qaeda, and a night raid would take place, and that guy would disappear. Whether he was Al-Qaeda or somebody who owed the sheikh money or someone who had a family debt going back 200 years was irrelevant. The thing about paying protection money, as anyone who has ever watched a mafia movie knows, is that as soon as you stop paying it, the problem starts again. I sat down with a Sunni sheikh who had been paid off by the United States, who was more than happy to tell me that one of the reasons that we passed through his checkpoints, in fact, I was sitting in his living room alive, was because America had paid him to assume this new role, and he was actually fairly comfortable with the idea. But he warned me that the money was stopping. The transition to the Maliki government was also supposed to include this transition of payoffs, and that wasn't happening. And while he certainly was going to be a polite host and allow myself and my team to leave peaceably that day, he really couldn't assure us that it would go on forever. By no coincidence, about 3 weeks later, there were 7 people shot in the back of the head, not too far from where this guy works. It's certainly in his area of control. They turned out to be Shia leaders that had been rounded up somewhere and brought for execution. Anyone who says that what's happening in Iraq right now is a surprise or unpredictable or anything along those lines is a liar or a fool. I'll challenge readers to go to my blog, wemeantwell.com. Go take a look at my blog post from 2011. predicting all of these things very accurately. And then ask yourself the question of who's working at the State Department now? The people who made the mistakes in 2011 that brought us to today, or the people that blew the whistle on it and got kicked out?
And the answer is it's the same people that helped create the mess, correct?
Absolutely, yes. The cast of characters has not changed at all. Tom Ricks has a column where he's got a gentleman named Ali Kadiri explaining what to do next in Iraq. Kadiri was the longest continuously serving American in the Iraq War. He never left. Currently, the State Department's point man on Iraq, who's in Iraq right now, is a guy named Brett McGurk, who was the senior advisor to 3 or 4 American ambassadors and almost was ambassador to Iraq until my blog outed him for some naughty sexual escapades on the roof of the embassy that were too embarrassing even for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to overlook. That said, they pushed him into a non-political position, and he's running the show. It's the same people. It's difficult to imagine why we won't have the same results.
Expanding on that, how do you assess the ISIS folks, and where do you see this going from your expert perspective and life history? What does your gut tell you is going to happen in Iraq now? And what do you think Obama is going to, in the long term, because he's going to announce a bunch of special forces today, obviously, but do you see this escalating into Iraq number 3?
A couple of good questions there. We'll start with ISIS. ISIS is almost a little bit of a microcosm, a way to look at this problem in one little piece. The key issue is that in Syria, as you mentioned at the top of the interview, the United States strongly supports ISIS. We arm them, we give them money, we train them. We have our own sneaky Pete's on the ground there helping them out. There are guys in Syria against the Assad regime. Over, of course, in Iraq, they're now our enemies, and we're preparing to at least unleash special forces on them, if not airstrikes. Whereas the United States sees some kind of line or a border, or imagines kind of a Berlin Wall with checkpoints between Syria and Iraq, there is none. It's open desert. Anyone who wanted to wander back and forth across that area is welcome to do so. And seeing these problems as national state problems, here's Syria, here's Iraq, here's Iran, is one of the huge failures of American foreign policy. They cross borders that don't really exist. As far as what's going to happen next, I think it's going to be only a question of whether the dissolution of Iraq occurs hyper-violently, a little bit violently, or only somewhat violently. It's impossible at this point to imagine any kind of realistic political reconciliation. Maliki has had almost 7, 8 years to pull that off. It's very doubtful at this time with troops in the field that's going to happen. The winner in all this is very easy to see, and that is Iran. Iran, thanks to the United States, had its most significant enemies, the Iraqis on the west, the Taliban on the east, eliminated, courtesy of the United States. And Iran has moved into Iraq in a huge way. They brokered the 2010 election that put Maliki in power when the United States had to step back, powerless to do that. They have their own special forces, the Quds Force, on the ground in Iraq. And they own Maliki. Maliki spent the Saddam years in Iran in exile and understands where his debts lie, whatever he happens to be mouthing bad about the Iranians these days for the United States to click their tongue at.
So you say that's him, he really works for them totally, that's all just window dressing?
I believe so, yes. I believe so. He's trying to get the United States to do some of his dirty work.
You know, that's a curious issue, because I'm not saying Iran is run by Western groups, but certainly the Shah was double-crossed at certain levels in '79. They allowed the Ayatollah Khomeini to fly in on a Paris. We know they did the Iran-Contra deal with them. And then the day Jimmy Carter was, defeated, then they released the hostages. Again, I mean, I'm a political Democrat-Republican because you have one group of Republicans leave and another group of Democrats come in. It's basically the same ideas, same systems, just different labels. But what is Iran's role in all this saber-rattling back and forth? I mean, I know Dick Cheney would talk bad about Iran all day, and then separately had deals where Halliburton, when he was vice president, he was making money off this. His blind trust was the only company that could sell oil field equipment to him. Or he'd try to get, according to Cy Hirsch, Navy SEALs to attack a U.S. ship to blame Iran. But then he'd also be doing deals to protect him. I mean, when you get down to brass tacks, there doesn't seem to be any policy at all. Only a bunch of special interest making money off of the chaos. I keep coming back to that.
Absolutely. I mean, Dick Cheney is someone who we really should stop listening to at this point. I think he's pretty much displayed his lack of credibility, his lack of prescience, and his utter lack of intelligence on any of these issues. The fact that he was more interested in making money for himself and his old cronies than saving American lives kind of tells the name of that tale. Iran is the winner in all this. And what will happen with Iran is Iran will continue to bolster its position as a regional power. Iran is going to secure its western border. It may push its western border de facto further towards Baghdad. I mean, they're never going to fly flags or anything like that, but they're going to control territory that they didn't control before.
Yeah, let's not forget there was an 8-year war between Saddam Hussein and Iran in the 80s, so they're getting politically and with covert military police force what they couldn't get in an overt war that killed millions.
Absolutely, courtesy of the United States and the 4,500 young men and women we sacrificed there. At the same time, Shias all over the Middle East are now seeing Iran as a major player for their safety, their security, and as a political force. That's something, again, that Iran would have had a very, very hard time doing. The Iranians.
Why would Israel then tacitly support funding Sunni groups trying to take over Syria, knowing that they would then pour in and take over Iraq later?
This is what happens when, like the United States, you pursue a policy of a long series of short-term goals.
So you're saying it's one-dimensional. They don't think a few plays down. They only think, I don't like Assad, take him out. They don't think we're going to put a giant Saudi Arabian system in control of this country that's clearly going to end up trying to come in and take over?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is it. If the chessboard analogy I offered has any validity, it's if it's three-dimensional chess, if not four-dimensional chess, or something even more complex. Once you kind of take a deep breath and start in on this, it's hard to get it all out in one exhale. You've got three different groups in Iraq that are supported by a half a dozen countries outside of Iraq. Each of those entities has splinter groups and separatists within inside of them.
Stay there. Let's find out where all this is going straight ahead with our guest. Amazing. Does the establishment think they've got a plan and that they're in control? Because, you know, clearly the Middle East is deteriorating. I know Google knew that the Arab Spring was coming and basically tried to ride what they already knew was coming because food prices went up, like they're now going up here. So, again, I'm not saying the establishment orchestrated the Arab Spring, but they now admittedly predicted it and tried to steer it, but it just doesn't ever seem to work. Or the State Department supporting right-wing Nazis in Ukraine who literally Heil Hitler to try to start a new war with Russia. Again, in my view, it's not that Russia's some angel. It's just that America is so bad now. Is it ineptness or what's happening in the minds of the people running things? Do they think they're doing a good job?
My own experience is whenever you're not sure, go with inept. It's the Occam's razor thing. The simplest answer is often the correct one, and my experience has been ineptness has ruled the day. Let's throw some predictions out there about Iraq, because as the president has told us, we need to look forward, not backward. And a lot of the commentary I'm reading, Dick Cheney and others, is looking backward. Let's find someone to blame, whether it's Obama, if you're from that part of the spectrum, or it's Bush from another. Those things happen for sure, and history will sort those out. But let's look forward. I think the situation in Iraq is very similar to the end of apartheid in South Africa. Everybody knows it's going to fall apart. Everyone knows it's an unsustainable system. The question is, how will it fall apart, and particularly how violently will it fall apart? I think in Iraq, there's no question that you're going to have three separate entities. I hate to use the word state because it implies a government who makes postage stamps and picks up the trash and things like that. So
it'll be like warlord-run sectors?
sectors. Let's say sectors. That's an excellent word for this. You're going to have the Kurds, by the way, who rarely come up in these discussions, have been keeping on for a very long time. They carved out their own de facto state early on in this game in 2003, and sit quietly back watching the rest of it happen behind their own walls with their own military. So, other than a little score settling and some adjusting of borders, we'll leave the Kurds aside for a second. The Shias, I think, will hold Baghdad, and they'll hold the areas south of Baghdad. Those are traditional areas. I doubt that a Sunni military, army, mob, tribal organization, or whatever really has the muscle.
So they'll get the West.
Something. The Sunnis will continue to hold the West. Anbar in western Iraq have been under de facto Sunni control for some time. What we're going to be fussing over is in the middle. And I suspect that the worst outcome will be continued violence, and that certainly will be what sending more U.S. fight into the thing will do, is just stir it up.
What does Saudi Arabia think it's getting by doing this? At least Iran doesn't get the whole country now?
It puts themselves in a position to push back against Iran whenever they want to do that. It puts themselves into a much weakened Iraq as a national state. Don't forget, Iraq basically invaded Kuwait and a good chunk of northern Saudi Arabia, though we don't like to talk about that too much. The Saudis have a state now that will not threaten them as a state acting entity.
Sure. I'm not defending Maliki in closing, but he basically is saying what you just said. He said all these interests want to break the country up. I don't want that. I guess from his own self-serving interest of prime minister wanting to be in control, or is that more talk?
Absolutely. He doesn't want to run off to South America with as much gold bullion as he carries and spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. But that indeed is going to be what happens.
So you're saying Iraq used to be in 3 parts. It needs to be in 3 parts?
Needs to or will be are 2 different words, but it certainly will end up that way.
All right. Thank you so much. Peter Van Buren, WeMeantWell.com. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Alex.